accommodate us.
Yeah. Yes. All right.
Yeah.
I refuse to turn around.
You can come thank them afterward. Also want to say thanks to Tech Systems. They sponsor our food and the beverages. Sebastian over here got us the Chick-fil-A. Always appreciated. Tech Systems is a recruiting agency in the Orlando area. They hire for most of the big companies around here, so if you're looking for a job, talk to Sebastian afterward. Maybe he can help you out.
I can't help but notice you're going into towards this direction.
Other sponsors wanted to say thanks to Big Vision, which is where we often meet, and they help things. We'll maybe back there next month. Yeah, I think that's it. We have an ongoing call for speakers for this meetup. I would love to have you speak at this meetup. Yes, you who doesn't even know React, you should speak here too. So see me or Lewis. Lewis is in the light blue shirt here. Lewis Lewis and I organize this meetup. We also have Matt Capri here, who founded this meetup with me a few years ago. Nice to have you back, sir. He's a product guy now, sort of. So he's abandoned us, nerds. Yeah, so I don't know. Any other preliminaries, Lewis? Does that about cover it?
That covers it.
Okay, great. Help yourself to we don't want Renee and Corey to have to eat it all.
I have no
We're talking about full stack GraphQL today. Node.js and React. Let's just get into it. So to start with, what is GraphQL? I'd imagine that many of you know this. I guess a disclaimer, if you are, if you consider yourself like moderately experienced or skilled with GraphQL, my objective will be to keep you awake here, but not much else, because this is pretty introductory. That was sort of the intention here. So the QL in GraphQL stands for query language, and GraphQL is a language for describing what your API can do. And I'd say practically it's an alternative to like REST for creating an API for web or mobile app or what have you. So why would we want to use GraphQL as opposed to whatever other method we're currently using of developing an API? GraphQL gives you a strongly typed schema, which means that the data that you get from the API is relatively predictable. Of course, you can still be naughty, but it's a lot harder when it's strongly typed. So that's cool. You can pretty much know what you're going to get when you make a request. With GraphQL, clients can request only the data that they need without any changes to the server. So if you think about a traditional REST endpoint, you're like, give me users, and you get a list of users, and those users have certain properties, and you have no control over what properties those are. You might need 5 and get 20, and so those other 15 properties is just wasted bytes across whatever network you're working on. GraphQL, you can declare as the client what exactly you want to query. Kind of the inverse of that, another benefit is that with GraphQL you can request, like I put disparate in here, distinct resources in a single request. So like if I want users and books, which don't really have anything to do with each other conceptually and probably wouldn't normally exist at a single endpoint like in a REST API, I can ask for both of those things in a GraphQL query because I can execute multiple like distinct queries in a single call, basically. And then developer experience with GraphQL, I think, is to me like the biggest selling point. It's awesome. The tools you get that are built in are just like excellent, like what you always kind of wished you had, at least what I always wished I had with an API. And you can do similar things with whatever API, but usually it's not like built in and out of the box, and so usually doesn't happen, right? Because priorities. So yeah, So this talk is basically like I made some slides so I wouldn't look lazy, but we're basically just gonna like write code here. We're gonna set up a server and client and get a little simple web app running with GraphQL. Full stack. So let's get into it. We have a starting point here. I only slightly cheated. So like this is basically just a vanilla create React app. If you have done any React development, you're probably familiar with create React app. So that's how I created this app. And the only thing I changed was the app.js, so like the UI component that renders the page, and the app CSS, because I don't think you all want to sit here watching me coming up with CSS. So yeah, so this is what it looks like on the here. It's a list of movies. I have these movies hard-coded in the client right now. It's just 6 of them, and these are the top 6 movies according to IMDb. Whether or not you agree with this list, you know, is, you probably don't, but I didn't doctor the results or anything, but like Shawshank Redemption, the main character's name is Andy Dufresne, and if you have to have your name sound like a character from a movie, it's hard to think of a better character. My name is Andrew Dushane, if I didn't introduce myself, so kind of worked out. Yeah, so that's it. So no network requests, no API happening here. This is just there's network requests like for the images and the JS or whatever, but there's no API here, just a hard-coded list of movies. So first thing we want to do is GraphQL server to serve up a longer list of movies, and then change the client so that it is querying the server instead of using this hard-coded list. So basically what I've done here is like combined a couple Apollo tutorials, but I feel like GraphQL is sort of just weird enough if you've never worked with it that it can be hard to even know like what page to go look up and copy and paste from. So hopefully, if nothing else, you get that out of this talk. And I am going to use Apollo for both the client and server. There are other GraphQL frameworks. Relay is the Facebook one. Facebook created GraphQL. They also created React. I guess thanks to Facebook that we're here, right? So they have one called Relay, which is different. It's more verbose, maybe more powerful for huge applications. I don't know. I haven't used it that much. But Apollo's really easy to get into. They have great documentation, big community. They've already released the hooks API that we're going to use for this. It's very cool stuff. So, and it's easy to get running both server side and client side. Okay, so I have to make this a little smaller. Get rid of the sidebar. Okay. So the first thing we need to do is get a server going. So I'm going to install some dependencies that we need, and we will test the limits of this Wi-Fi. So I need Apollo server and GraphQL. I'm going to use Yarn, which is just like NPM, but I like it better for some reason. So I'm adding Apollo server and GraphQL. These are just libraries that we'll use to create our API. And I'm going to create a file in the server folder called index.js. Cool. And then I'm going to come down here and copy and paste a bunch of code, all right? So this is a schema definition. So, can you read this? Is this reasonably readable? Yeah?
He's a little more. Maybe just one, just a little bit.
Little bigger?
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe sit a little farther away. Just. Okay, so type defs. So we are just inlining a GraphQL schema definition here. And it's a very simple one. We have a type of book, which is going to be an object which contains 2 fields, title and author. And then we have a query type, which has a books query, which returns a list of books. That's what this syntax means here. So, couple things. I guess a query type is just standard GraphQL. All of your queries go inside of your query type, and then typically you'd also have a mutation type. So with GraphQL, a query is like a get. So you like give me this information, and a mutation is what you would use like a put, post, or a delete for. You can create a record, modify a record, delete a record, what have you. We're not going to get into mutations because it just would take too long. So we'll just cover queries today. But you typically would have a top-level query and mutation type, and then all of your queries would go inside of that. Another thing about schema is that you can define schema outside of whatever language you're using. So if it's PHP, Ruby, C#, Node.js, whatever, you can files and then have some sort of like loader that will understand what that is. This just enables us to inline it in JS using this GQL helper that Apollo server exports. I think I would have to add a loader to the Webpack setup, which in Create React app isn't like that straightforward. So we'll just inline it here in the JS. But you give it a tag template literal with your schema, just like you would write it out in a GraphQL file, and it understands that it's GraphQL. So that's our type defs. In a GraphQL schema, everything has to come down to scalar or like primitive types. So you can't be like book and it's an object and there's stuff in there. Don't worry about it. You have to define every field that's inside of that book. So these books have two fields, title and author. Those are the only fields that should be available on the book type in this API. So here is some data. Those are books, 2 books. A little bit more interesting is the resolver. So a resolver tells the GraphQL server how to send the data that's requested in a query, or what to do when a mutation is executed. So in this case, it's very simple. When the books query comes in, we're going to return this array. Okay? So not much happening there, but that is where basically all of the action happens. And your query or your resolvers have to match your schema. So I have a books query here, and this result will be named books because the GraphQL server will find it according to its name on the query type. Yep. And then lastly, we initialize the server and start it up. So cool. So it's new Apollo server. You pass it the type defs and the resolvers. There's also like 100 million other config options, of course, for a production app that you may dev environment. All we need is type definitions and resolvers. And it'll start up by default at localhost 4000. So I'm going to go over to package.json and add a script to start the server, which will just be node server, and that should call server/index.js with the node runtime. Actually, I'm not going to do it here. I'm going to do it over here. So if I run yarn server, it started up. Magic. Okay, so if we go back to the browser, Apollo server does a cool thing where it exposes the GraphQL playground by default in the dev environment. So if I want to do something here, I just typed a B, and it's like, oh, do you want books? So it's going to give me lots of helpful hints about what I can do. So I'm now defining a query, a books query, and I'll just give it the 2 fields that are available, which are title and author. And I run that query, and I get back that list of books that we passed to the resolver, right? And then just like I was saying before about the client defining what data is returned, if I only want the title, then I can execute the query and I only get titles on each book. So it's pretty cool. So the server is working, that's great, but it's giving us books, and I want movies, so whatever that says, we need to change it to give us some movie data, which I have here somewhere, I hope. Yeah, okay, so I have a big JSON file that has all the 250 of the top IMDb movies. So I'm gonna put that here into the server folder, and then I'm gonna go back to the server and modify things a bit. So I'm gonna require the movie data so we have access to it. And now we need to change the schema, right? We don't want books, we want movies. And I'm just gonna pass the data through like we did with the books. I'm not gonna change anything, so that means I can just go look at movie data, see what the fields are on each movie, and add them to the type in the GraphQL schema, right? So we've got title, year, rating, URL, rank, image, title string, oop, nope. VS Code, it's usually so great. Year is an integer, rank is an integer, rating. So there are distinct types for integers and floats, and there are other number types in GraphQL as well. URL, image. Did I miss anything? Anybody have a photographic memory? Let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, got it all. Okay, so, and I'm gonna go ahead and make these all required. If you put an exclamation point on any field, that makes it required. And since every movie has these things, they should always be there if they're requested, and there's a problem if they're not. So, might as well require them. And then I'm gonna change this books query to a top movies query. And we want that to return a list of movies, not a list of books. And again, I'm gonna make this required. So putting those exclamation points means that top movies must always return an array. That's the outside exclamation point. And then its members must only be movies and not null or some other sort of falsy value. It could return an empty array, which it won't, but it could given this definition. So we don't need books anymore. We don't need books anymore. Take that out of context. So top movies query is just gonna return movie data, just like the books query did. It's just gonna pass it right through. So save that, go back here, restart the server. I don't have hot reloading on the server. I don't know how to do that, so I'm sorry. I'm gonna refresh this so that the schema gets updated, and then, yeah, so now it's gonna autocomplete with the only query in our schema, top movies, and I should be able to, boom, we can add some stuff we want. Cool, okay, so the server is set up, it's doing what we want it to do. Now we're gonna go client side and get that set up with Apollo client and querying this data from the server. First thing I'm gonna do before I forget and can't figure out why everything is broken is I'm gonna add a proxy. So this is functionality that's provided by Create React App. Create React App is so great. In dev mode, if you define a proxy in package.json, it'll pass your network requests that aren't like, give me the JS for my app, through to whatever the proxy that you define is. So in our case, we're going to be sending requests to /GraphQL, and our Webpack dev server for our client is just going to forward those right over to localhost 4000 so that it can hit the GraphQL server and we can get the data. Okay, so that's good. So we'll go over to app.js. So I've got this movies, just this hard-coded list of movies. We want to get rid of this. We want to do something more fun. So I'm going to go back to the Apollo docs and copy and paste some more stuff. Now we need to set up the client. So this is like getting started with Apollo client in a React app. So we need some more dependencies. We already have GraphQL, but we don't have Apollo Boost or @Apollo/React hooks, which is like the React library that we'll use that gives us the provider and the hooks, the query and mutation hooks that we'll need. So just install those dependencies. Wi-Fi is going great. It's awesome. Thanks. Okay, cool. So, right. So we need to create a client, and then we need to wrap our app, or wherever the top level of where we need GraphQL queries, in a provider. So if you're familiar with React Context, Apollo Provider is just a context provider that's going to provide the GraphQL client and also a cache of data, which is pretty nice, that will serve up data as opposed to hitting the network for it when appropriate. So let's use our handy-dandy technique of copying things. This goes up here. All right. Now our URI, we don't want that. We just want /GraphQL, which I believe is just the default if I did nothing here, but for clarity's sake and possibly not being the case, let's do that. Now I need to define a query here, client side. So you see they've got a query here of rates. We're going to do something similar. I'm going to GQL, just like we did on the server, and then define a query in here, which is in GraphQL language. Query. Let's call it. Okay, so inside of this query, this name I gave it here, this could actually be anything, so that's just sort of for client-side bookkeeping, but this needs to, now I need to match up with what the server is going to expect, so I want to call it top movies, and then all the fields that I need. So we're using title, URL, image, year, and rank. And they're actually, there's a VS Code extension too that will like ingest your schema and then do all that GraphQL playground autocomplete in your editor. It's pretty sick. I should have done that for this, but I didn't think about it. But highly recommend. Yeah, like I said, the developer experience is a big selling point for GraphQL in my opinion. It's pretty great. What else do we need? Image. Okay, I think that's it. Cool. All right. So, and now we need to query the data. Oh, no, we need to do the provider first. Forgot about that. Okay, so, oh, surprised VS Code didn't yell at me for that. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to set up the provider, and I'm just going to wrap the top level app in the provider. So I've already got my client down here. I'm going to make a new component called provider app. And it's just going to be the Apollo provider, and it just needs this one prop of the client. And then we'll render the app inside there. And then we need to change the default export to be the wrapped. Stored on entities, how you want to do caching, if you want some sort of persistence like the local storage, that's all. But it's all somewhat abstracted for you. I mean, at least those things and a bunch of other stuff, so that's pretty cool. You just have to kind of follow the rules. All right, so we've got the provider app, and then last thing I need to do is actually execute the query so we can get the data, right? So I'm going to use the use query, that's the worst thing about hooks is trying to talk about them, I think. Use the use query hook. Right, so use query requires a query, and it's going to return an object, which I'm going to destructure here, and it's going to give us a loading property, an error property, and a data property. And I'm going to call useQuery with that top movies query that we defined. Okay. And assuming everything goes well, the movies will be at data.topmovies. Data is going to be basically in the shape of the query that we have here. So I'm leaving where it is, and I'm going to add a search movies query. And search movies is going to take a variable called search, which will be a string, and then it'll return the same thing top movies does, a list of movies, or an empty array. And then I need to define a resolver of the same name, right, so that the server knows what to do when search movies is queried. Okay, so GraphQL, by default, the way the server's set up, you'll get at least 3 arguments. I know the first 3 are something we call root, which I meant to see what that actually is for this presentation, but I forgot. You never use it. I don't know. So skip the first one. Second one's the variables that are passed from the client, and the third is context, which if you've done any API development, this is like your user, whatever you put in the context of your requests. GraphQL uses this mechanism for it, where the third variable would be like whatever you put into context through middleware or what have you. So all we really need is the variables, but that first argument will be in the way. So, and then I'm just going to return, again, because it's JSON, this is pretty easy, but this is where you'd be like, movie dot, well, yeah, see, it's trying to fix my stuff, but if I had a movie model and an ORM of some sort, it'd be like title variables dot search, yeah. But we don't have anything that fancy, so it'll just be movie data. We'll filter it. So my variable again is called search. Right, so that should send a filtered list of movies that only match the search by title. And actually, I want to return that, and then in the case that there is no search, I just want to return an empty array. So if okay, cool. So yeah, that's what search movies looks like. Save that, restart the server, and then we can go verify in GraphQL Playground that it works. It doesn't. What's it say? Already in use. Oh, shut down the wrong thing, I think. Cool. Yeah, I shut down client. Start that back up. All right, so. All right, so we should now have a search. Okay, search movies, search. Good movies are dark, so let's see what dark gets us. Just kidding, just kidding. Boom, okay, cool. So it seems to work, right? It's giving us back titles that match our query, so awesome. What's that?
That toys isn't in that list.
Ah, sorry. Go vote on IMDb vigorously. All right, so now we need to go client side and consume that query instead of our static top movies list. Right, so this will be search movies query. Right, and then we need to do a few things here. So we're going to tell it that it's getting a variable called search, which we want to pass to search movies as search. So like this right here is what needs to match the schema. I could technically call this anything if I wanted to for whatever reason. But we need to pass this search variable for the server to understand what's happening and that resolver to execute like it's supposed to. Right, so we have a new query, and then, nope, not that. I'll do a new query here. But we need to give it a search, right? So I need to get some way to get that. I could just like hard code one, but let's just go ahead and add an input. So I'll use state. I'll use state in React. If you're not familiar with hooks, why are you here? Just kidding. This is like the equivalent of set state in a class component. You call use state with the initial state, and it gives you back it gives you the current state and then a setter for this to update the state, or an updater in an array, in an ordered array. So the first item is the state, and the second item is the updater. Right, and then let's see if I can remember what I call these CSS classes. Let's hope. Label pop quiz. So HTML4 or 4 in HTML corresponds to the ID or the name? I don't know either, so I just do both. I bet somebody knows though. Okay. And then an input, so ID search, name search. Of course it's React, so it would actually work without that, but it wouldn't be as good or accessible. So the value is going to be search. And then on change, don't screenshot this, but it's fine. I'm just going to inline it here. We're going to set search e.target.value. We need to close that. That also needs the class name. Input, super creative. Right, so we don't have data.topMovies, but we should have data.searchMovies. or at least an empty array. Yeah, okay, so now we've got an input, and we've got nothing else. So if you are following along with the code, you're probably wondering what we're going to do with this search thing, right? So like, there are a bunch of ways you can handle to be good web stewards. Okay. Oh, yeah, it's jumping around a lot, and that's because of this, my loading thing here. Loading is toggling every time I perform a new query, which is unfocusing the input. Not the best user experience. Your designers might not appreciate that. But we can fix that. So I actually made a little loading spinner to try to be slightly fancy. So we'll just move the loading state down here because we don't need to not show anything if loading is true. So let's try that again. Cool. Yeah, so if you don't believe me about the cache, we can see that in action down here. So the last search that was executed here was for MA. So if we leave this network request highlighted and I type MA again, it's not going to do anything because it already knows that the results for MA are in the cache. And you can bypass that in that config object. You can be like, always hit the server no matter what, because I don't trust, things need to be up to date or whatever. But in a case like this, where these would be relatively static, this is pretty cool. We're saving some micro cents in AWS, and somebody will be pleased, I'm sure. Yeah, so we've done that. Now we're passing this variable. We've got a slightly more complex query going on. Things are still working. It's great. I think, why don't we look at my slides that I forgot about. So we did that. Set up the client, yeah, okay, send the variable, yeah, that was it. Okay, so one other thing I wanted to do was just to show a little bit more about the documentation side of things. No, print, window, okay. Right, so if we go back to our schema here, your documentation can just live right alongside the code. I don't know, who else uses Swagger for an API? Like, the idea of Swagger is that it's like documentation for your API, and it like tells you everything that can come in and go out. But in my experience at multiple organizations, it tends to never be quite up to date. I know there are ways for it to stay in sync automatically with an API, but I've never seen anyone actually like bother to make that happen. The great thing about like GraphQL Playground, Graphical, which is like another version of the same thing, action that GraphQL can do is that it runs off of your code. It doesn't run off of some like separate thing that you have to maintain or set up. It's just there. So we can add descriptions in our schema, which are denoted by triple double quotes for whatever reason. So I'm going to say title of the movie, in case you didn't understand that. Boom. right? So just like adding some descriptive text to each field, rating, I don't know what the rating is. Image. Okay, cool. I did something wrong. What's that? Ah, thank you. Yeah, I can tell because prettier doesn't like mangle it, so there we go. It's put everything on multi-lines, which is fine, whatever. So if I go back, shut the server off, and then go look at the playground, we can see what that did for our docs. Okay, right, so I need to refresh this page. Let's expand this out a bit. So with rank highlighted, now it tells me the description, rank in all-time best movies per IMDb. So these are all pretty like intuitive, right? But in an API where things aren't necessarily that way, this can be super helpful. And then if we go to the docs, this is where you can just directly explore the schema. So we know we have 2 queries, and we only actually have like one type, right, the movie. But if we get down to these scalar fields on movie, it gives us the built-in GraphQL description of a string, but also the description that I've provided there just right in the code. So I think that whole thing's introspection deal is pretty awesome. Yeah, I know there are, I'll post the code for this. I fully expect no one to look at it, but I'll post it anyway, just in case. And I'll add some resources on there too, like where those Apollo pages live. There are some cool open, like relatively open GraphQL APIs. There's the GitHub v4, like their newest API. They went from REST to GraphQL for their public API. There are a bunch of like, give me like fake JSON GraphQL APIs, which I can't think of any of the names, but I'll put those. And then there are also GraphQL as a service, like sort of Firebase, but GraphQL type of services, which are also cool, which render, the bulk of this talk unnecessary, right? Because you can use somebody else's server and they make everything work for you, which is cool. Yeah, so I'll post all that and put it in the meetup channel. But I think that's it for the talk. Does anyone have any questions? Yes, sir.
Have you worked anywhere that implemented this kind of thing in production?
Have I worked anywhere that implemented this in production? Yes. I am currently working on a GraphQL migration in one app that I work on, and I worked for a long time on a production app that was fully, all of the client-server interaction was GraphQL. We didn't actually use Apollo server. Well, no, that's not true. I think it was Apollo Express server, so something similar to this, not quite as out of the box, but integrated with an Express API, because at some point it transitioned from something else to GraphQL. But yes, and it's really nice. I've worked on like both the API and client side. I feel like, maybe I have a skewed look at things because I'm primarily a front-end developer, but it seems like GraphQL is more beneficial for the consumer than the provider, like the API, like more, better for us than for the API developers generally, but it is nice to work. Like, you get cool errors. I guess I won't demonstrate it, but if I were to like typo a resolver here and call it like top movies with a Z, the server won't even start up. It's going to be like, hey, your resolver doesn't match anything in the schema, so fix it. Whereas with a lot of like setups, everything would just silently fail and there'd be no data, and like what's happening, right? So yeah, so I've enjoyed working with it on both sides of the app. and yeah, it's definitely out there in production. I know like Facebook is doing their big like redesign of their UI. It's an entirely new app, and it's going to be React powered on the front end and GraphQL on the back end, like fully. And it's, I don't know. If you go to the GraphQL docs or the Apollo docs, they have all kinds of big names that are like, we use GraphQL. So,
Second part of that is,
yeah.
was there any kind of struggle to get the backend people to buy into it?
Not that hard. Like the thing I'm currently working on, the selling point is mainly like our API is a mess, and it's partly because it's so easy to just put anything anywhere, and it's all sort of masked. It's like, here's an endpoint, and it does stuff, you know. It does things that are almost identical, like 99% the same as this other endpoint, but like this one other thing is totally different, but it has the same name. And you can do that with GraphQL, right? You can be dirty in any sort of framework or language, but it's a lot harder because things are so much more explicit. It's like, okay, we already have a movie type. We don't need a second movie type with like 2 different fields. You know, let's just figure out how to make this all work together. So I think that organizational aspect of it was what helped sell it on the back end. Yeah, I mean, you know, there are different organizations have different problems, right? So, yeah.
Is there any opportunity here to use GraphQL as a layer on top of a third-party API? Like if I was using an API from somebody else, their REST endpoints, could I spin up my own backend and put a layer of GraphQL on top of it? Is that even possible?
Yeah, so the question was, can we, I'm just repeating in case there's like one person watching the stream. Can we wrap an existing API that's like REST or whatever with the GraphQL API? My guess, like my sense, is that the majority of GraphQL APIs in production right now are exactly that, because it's so hard to like migrate a full API from whatever it is to a new thing. And you get sick enough of like, oh, I hate this thing about this API, and you just wrap it up with GraphQL, and you know, it's at least from the client's perspective, it's nice and clean. So yeah, definitely that it will do that all the time. I think GraphQL is a good, you know, if you're like a microservice architecture, you have a ton of different things that do different stuff, maybe like different languages, whatever. You can put like a middle GraphQL layer that evens everything out for the client with those things. So definite, strong yes to that. Yes, sir.
What are some of the downsides of GraphQL, if any?
There are definitely downsides to GraphQL. It's super verbose, right? So I can't just be like /movies gives me where I define everything. It's opinionated in ways that you have to go out of your way to like defy convention. You can see that as a benefit or not. But I think that, you know, that can be problematic. There are other issues with it, like if you have huge queries, you know, one of the selling points of GraphQL is like, oh, we save data because clients only query the data that they need, right? But you also have to send this huge query if you need a lot of fields, right? There are ways around that. You can basically like cache your query, like say, okay, like, this magic string means give me this big old query, that sort of thing, but you end up having to work around that. That's not going to be an issue, like, unless unless someone's counting your AWS and says, hey, you know, whatever. But yeah, so I guess that's sort of an obscure downside. Yeah, I don't know. I don't see it. I prefer it. It's my favorite way to do an API currently. So I don't have like a big long list of downsides, but there certainly are some. Yeah.
What strategies do you suggest in regards to security when developing GraphQL APIs?
Yeah, so with regard to security, I mean, you have the same concerns as you do with any other like exposed service, right? So if you've got, if you've got like a single page app and you've got an open API that it has to hit, then you need to be wary of denial of service. Like you want to make sure that you rate limit. Also, their GraphQL, that's another potential downside, is that GraphQL, like I said at the beginning, you can request disparate resources in a single request, right? You can also request a billion resources in a single request. You can be like, give me the first 10 and the second 10 and like up to 1 million. And so if you kind of just like do things without thinking about that, then you can expose yourself to huge, like crippling single call, like massive queries that would like lock your database up or whatever. So there's that. But I think generally, like, if you're talking about security, like logging in and stuff, authentication you can handle the same way you do with any other API. And then I guess the main abilities that GraphQL queries open, and making sure that you're not exposing yourself to denial of service attacks through that. Yeah.
We touched a little bit on the caching capabilities of it. Could you effectively use Apollo to replace something like Redux?
Could you use Apollo to replace something like Redux? That's another one that the answer to is absolutely, in my opinion. When I first started working with Apollo, I was like, okay, cool, so like where do we do the actions? Where's the reducer? And at the time, Apollo actually used Redux under the hood, so it was like stuff would happen in Redux DevTools. It's a little exciting, but we didn't end up using Redux at all, and I have not found in any GraphQL app that I missed Redux whatsoever, especially now that context is a like public first-class API, right? If you need some sort of global state that Apollo can't manage, like say a theme, right? Like your color theme switches when something happens or whatever, you can pretty... Apollo specifically does have a local state thing where you can manage client-side state in the Apollo cache and pretend it's like, GraphQL or treat it as GraphQL. I've found that to be more verbose than is worthwhile. Rather just use a separate context provider, but I guess if you wanted everything in Apollo, you could technically do that. But yeah, I think if you have a query and then you're trying to put the results of your query in a Redux store, it's just generally going to be redundant, and then you're opening yourself up to bugs if things get out of sync, right? So I think the Apollo has that caching mechanism built in, and it's really meant to be the source of the data that you're getting from your server. In my opinion, you really don't need Redux or any sort of other global store, unless it were for completely other data that's not involved with what you're getting through GraphQL. Yeah.
So Vitriol09 in the chat room is asking, would GraphQL make sense for a microservice?
Vitriol09? That's a really like nice question from somebody with the name Vitriol. The question was, would GraphQL make sense for a microservice? I mean, yeah, I think anywhere where you're exposing some sort of like data service, GraphQL can make sense. It really depends, like, what the microservice does, right? But yeah, assuming you have some sort of like graph-like data being operated on in your service, then yeah. Again, I mean, I think an application of GraphQL that you see a lot is that it wraps microservices, but there's nothing to say that you can't directly use GraphQL on a microservice. Vitriol09. Anyone else? Cool. We didn't go too long, I guess. Less than an hour. Cool. I don't know, Gabe, what do you think, man? 10 minutes? Can we hang out for 10 more minutes? Gabe has a library.
You want it?
kicking us out at 9.
That's, I mean, okay, that's fine then.
Let's keep it to 10 minutes. I did see some. I saw some like.
Nah, I mean, I'd rather just have the time rather, so we'll do it.
Do it another time. Okay.
It'll be fine.
All right.
We only have 10 minutes. I'll look at it.
All right. Cool.
You're saying kicking us out at 9.
Yeah. That's an hour. No, that's an hour and 10 minutes from now.
Yeah, an hour and 10, yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, it's almost.
Yeah, that was the implication. Sorry.
You on Newfoundland time there?
Sorry, I wasn't.
It's all good.
I was only looking at the minutes. It's okay, I also do programming, I'm terrible.
Right. And dates. Whew. All right. Then I'll go ahead and disconnect.
So, we're gonna broadcast this.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So this is Gabe Klein. Gabe's spoken at React Orlando before. He's just gonna do like a lightning talk about a cool hooks utility.
Yeah.
Put together. Yeah. Yeah. Come up here, dude. Oh, we don't have to do it, man.
So, let me know the goal.
I didn't even think about that. Sorry. Yeah, help yourself to the food.
kind of a library nerd. I like to make utilities and stuff to put on NPM so you can download it and all my stuff can break. So in any event, here's the deal. I made this library called React Use Controller. And basically what this is a concept for you to take hooks and not even know how to use them and get a lot of power out of JavaScript classes. So long story short, what it does is it takes any class.
Your screen's not showing.
Oh, it isn't? Like sharing like on the...
Yeah, I don't know if you might have closed your...
Oh, okay, on the stream. Okay, I'm gonna quickly fix that. Let's try to get that. So there was a link over here. Presenter and share screen. Start share screen. Maybe that'll fix it. That'll work. Live?
Yes, you do.
Okay. And it's good on YouTube too?
Yeah.
All right. Very nice. So, guys, basically what I have here is React Use Controller. And what this purpose is to give you an ability to take any class, set values in it, set something equals something, and then it's going to produce a special kind of hook, the same way any hook uses, where it gives you some state and set state. But instead, what it gives you is a single reference to a single instance of a controller. And so I'm going to show you kind of how this works, and we're going to kind of walk through together the purpose of that. So right here I have a quick web page that I've built, and it's got all this loaded. And we're going to start simple, and we're going to work our way up. So first we're going to say hello world, because obviously we want to show that we can show stuff, and post law notwithstanding. We get stuff, we get hello world. Yay, give me props. Okay. And then so now, obviously we want this to reflect some state. We want it to change when we do some stuff. So the kind of regular thing that you might do is go into your thing and start talking like state, and then set state, and then we're gonna do use state, because that's kind of how let's use. We want that to auto. Oh, it's over here. And then we're gonna set this to hello, so we know something changed. And we're gonna put that over there. Wrap it. Okay. And let's see if it turns into a look. Okay. So we're good. And then so if we were to say on click, and we wanted to do something with that, we would go set state and spell and say goodbye instead. And so when we click on it now, it's going to say goodbye. But of course, verbs. That's always nice. Oh, I think I need to do this. This is where I didn't forward the on clicks on this. That'll fix it right away. So still doesn't. Great. Maybe I think I did. Oh, there we go. That's what we do. The demo curse. And then okay. Yay. So anyway. Bunch of hellos and goodbyes. Like, how do you manage all that? How do you make that easier to go about? And usually it would be kind of tough. Like a bad example would be, say, if you had many things to increment, right? And so you would have value 1, value 2, value 3, set value 1, set value 2, set value 3, and you'd have just a bunch of stuff to have to do. That would not be very fun to go about doing. At least I don't think it would be. And so what we're going to do is we have a solution for that now using something called use controllers. And so that is what this is. So you import it, and it gives you two things: use and a more advanced thing called controller. We're not going to really talk about that now because this is just a lightning talk. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to say const state. I just could call it literally anything I wanted. And I'm going to say just use. That's it. And so it's going to auto import use. And so we're going to go ahead and get rid of that and kind of start a little bit fresh. And so I've prepared a little bit of an example. So you don't have to watch me type a bunch of stuff. I'm just going to copy and paste it like I don't know what I'm doing. And we're going to try it out. So over here, I have an example of a counter. And so basically what we've done here is that we have a class, you see that, and it has a value, right? I just set it to 1, and then so I'm pulling the value 1, and I'm going to make this a little better because we can for everybody. It pulls out the value, and we just use the value. And then we have increment and decrement, which are methods on this state. And then so now, it sees every time any one of these methods are called, it just updates the state because this dot value is either higher or lower, and the use hook over here can detect changes to what is called a model. If you know React, then you know the concept of model view controllers. And so essentially, this serves as a model and a controller in one, and hence it's a model controller. And so if you take this object and load it with any number of values or methods or asynchronous calls, whatever have you, you can make a really awesome app that is able to control itself very easily without anything terribly complicated about how it's implemented. An example of this, well, I had another one earlier, but I probably missed it, so I can't do it here. But I can certainly take some questions and show you some stuff that you may, if you want to know how it works, or you want to know if something might work, let me know, and I can demonstrate it.
By the way, that's awesome.
Thank you.
Put it out there. But looking at it, what do you think is an advantage over, for example, something like Mobex, which is also a big...
This actually is based largely off of Mobex behavior. So, before we had hooks, I was using Mobex a lot for this exact reason. But one of the bigger reasons is that this is barely a kilobyte on import, for one thing. There's no decorators, and since the decorator spec has changed even in the last month, it's very difficult to import this into probably a vanilla project, while this just works immediately. Thirdly, it's just a hook. It's just use, and you take any old thing you want. But here's kind of an added bonus. Because it already has to do a bunch of setup to get you all the stuff to do this hookup, you actually get lifecycle too, right? Like when you have use effect and stuff, we can actually do this. So I can say on mount over here, and it's going to mount. I can use and function, go over here, set it to 1 second each time, and over in here I'm going to just say this value, this dot value plus plus, right? And so now every second it's just going to auto increment, because what you're doing is you're editing the this value, and then you're just having a function that is called, and it just works. And this is a lot simpler in my mind than having a bunch of use states, a bunch of use effects with the empty bracket you have to remember, otherwise it doesn't work and hits every render, stuff like that. And that's basically the general gist. It's a lot more powerful, has a lot more features, and I've taken a lot of time to make examples and documentation that you can take a look at with even examples that show you exactly how all this stuff works and what you can accomplish with it, with Code Sandbox and everything. So go crazy. I can't wait to see what you can do with this library. And that's it.
So yeah, we are done. Thank you for coming out, hanging out. We normally meet the third Thursday. I believe this is actually the fourth Thursday, so we're a little messed up, but we'll try to get back on schedule next month. Please, if you have any desire to speak, let us know. If you're not in the Slack, also you can see me or Lewis or Dushane after, and we'll get you an invite. It's just a Slack community of Orlando developers, and you can hear about things that are happening and network and whatnot there. Yeah, so we'll please try to finish the chicken, and good night.